They said no man would ever stay for a woman the desert had broken, but the desert doesn't decide what a man keeps, it only tests what he's willing to lose. And on that afternoon when the sky turned the color of rust and the wind began to rise like something waking beneath the earth, Ethan Cole was 30 miles from the nearest town with nothing but a half-empty canteen, a tired horse, and the kind of silence most men can't stand. But he had learned to live inside it, to let it settle in his bones the way dust settles on old wood, and that was why he heard her before he saw her, not a scream, not yet, just the faintest sound carried between gusts, something human trying not to be swallowed by the storm, and Ethan turned his horse without thinking, because out here hesitation had a way of becoming regret, and regret didn't last long in a place that buried everything by morning. The wind hit him hard as he rode, sand cutting across his face like a warning, the sky collapsing lower with every second until the world became nothing but motion and noise and red haze. But then he saw it, a shape half covered, barely more than a shadow against the ground, and he slid from the saddle, boots sinking into shifting sand as he moved toward her, slow, steady, like approaching a wounded animal that might bolt if it believed the world still had teeth. Her hair was tangled with dust, her dress torn by the storm's hands, and her skin carried that pale stillness that comes when the body is trying to decide whether to keep fighting. Ethan didn't speak, not because he didn't care, but because words didn't matter here, not against wind like this. Instead he knelt and brushed sand from her face, just enough to see that she was breathing, shallow, uneven, but alive, and that was enough. He slid his arms beneath her shoulders and lifted, feeling the weight of someone who had already given too much to the land, and as he turned, the wind shifted again, stronger, sharper, forcing him to brace, and that's when he noticed it, not in full, just a wrongness in the way her body rested against him, the kind of detail most men would ignore until it was too late. But Ethan had seen enough loss to recognize it early. He didn't look twice, didn't let it change the way he held her. Instead he tightened his grip and pushed forward, step by step, each one a fight against a storm that didn't care who survived. His horse waited where he left it, restless but loyal, and together they moved, man and animal and the fragile life between them, until the outline of his cabin cut through the haze like something stubborn enough to exist. Inside, the world went quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels heavier after noise, and Ethan laid her down on the narrow bed, stepping back just enough to give space, to let the moment settle, because whatever had been taken out there in the storm wasn't his to name, not yet. And when her eyes finally opened, slow, uncertain, the first thing she saw wasn't comfort, wasn't safety. It was a stranger standing in the doorway with dust on his coat and silence in his hands, and in that moment, before a single word was spoken, the distance between them was already as wide as the desert itself. Clara did not scream when she woke the second time, not like before. Instead she stared, long and steady, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls, the kind of light that made everything look softer than it really was, and for a moment she did not move, as if still deciding whether she was alive or simply dreaming of a quieter place. But then she saw him again, standing near the door, not watching her like a threat, not even watching her at all. Just standing there with his hat in his hands as though he had stepped into a room that did not belong to him, and that unsettled her more than anything else. Because men who meant harm usually filled the space with it, they leaned forward, they claimed it, but this man held himself back like the air between them mattered, like crossing it required permission. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice thin but steady, and Ethan lifted his eyes just enough to meet hers without stepping closer. "My place," he said, nothing more, no explanation, no reassurance, and that was when she tried again to sit up, slower this time, more careful, her hands pressing into the rough blanket beneath her as if testing whether the ground would hold, and for a moment it did, her body rising, her breath catching in her throat, until it didn't, until something inside her shifted wrong again and the world tilted, and she froze, not falling, not yet, just suspended in that terrible space between knowing and refusing to know. And Ethan saw it, the exact second the truth reached her, not through sight but through absence, through the silence where something should have answered, and he turned his head away, not out of shame, but out of respect for a moment that was not his to witness. She looked down slowly, the movement deliberate, like lowering yourself into cold water, and when her hands found the edge of the bandage, she stopped breathing altogether, not because of what she saw, but because of what she understood, and the room seemed to shrink around that understanding, pressing closer, quieter, until even the wind outside felt distant. "No," she whispered, not loudly, not dramatically, just a simple refusal offered to no one in particular, and Ethan remained where he was, not stepping forward, not offering words that would only make it worse, because out here, loss did not need to be explained, it only needed to be endured. She lifted her eyes again, sharper now, searching his face for something she could hold against him, some sign that this had been his doing, some reason to turn him into the kind of man she already knew how to hate. "What did you do?" she asked, and the question hung between them like dust in sunlight, slow and heavy, and Ethan answered just as simply, "Brought you inside." Nothing more, no defense, no anger, just truth laid bare without asking to be believed, and that was what unsettled her most, because if he had argued, if he had tried to convince her, she could have pushed back, she could have built a wall out of suspicion, but he did not give her that, he gave her nothing to fight. And outside, the faint sound of hoofbeats began to echo again across the open land, distant but growing, a reminder that whatever had happened out there in the storm had not ended, it had only followed them home. The sound carried closer this time, no longer something the wind could swallow, steady and deliberate, the rhythm of horses that knew exactly where they were going, and Clara heard it too, her eyes shifting past Ethan toward the thin sliver of light at the door as if she could see through wood and distance both. "They are coming for me," she said, not with fear, but with certainty, and that certainty felt heavier than anything she had shown before, because it meant she understood the world outside this cabin had not changed just because hers had. Ethan moved then, not toward her, but toward the window, a small square cut into the wall where glass had long since been replaced by open air and a piece of cloth that stirred with the breeze. He lifted it just enough to look, his posture still, measured, as if the land itself might speak to him if he listened long enough, and when he let the cloth fall back into place, he did not rush, did not reach for the rifle leaning in the corner. He simply stood there for a moment, thinking, and Clara watched him, trying to understand what kind of man pauses when trouble is already on its way. "You should leave," she said, the words coming quicker now, sharper, like she was trying to push him into motion before it was too late. "If they find you here with me, they will not ask questions." Ethan glanced back at her, his expression unchanged, not hardened, not softened, just steady. "They usually do not," he said, and there was no bitterness in it, just fact, the kind that comes from years of being judged before being heard. The hoofbeats grew louder, close enough now that even the walls seemed to feel them, and Clara's hands tightened against the blanket, her breath uneven, not from panic, but from something deeper, something that had not yet found its shape. "You do not understand," she continued, her voice lowering, almost urgent. "My father will not see this the way it happened, he will see what it looks like, and what it looks like is enough." Ethan stepped away from the window and reached for his hat, brushing the dust from it with a slow motion that felt almost out of place against the rising tension. "Then he will see what he wants," he said, placing it back on his head, and for the first time, there was the faintest edge in his tone, not anger, but something firmer, something that did not bend easily. Clara studied him, searching again for that crack, that sign he would choose himself over this moment, that he would walk out the back and let her deal with what was coming alone, because that was what she expected, what she had always been taught to expect. But he did not move toward the back door, did not prepare an escape. Instead he walked to the front and stopped just short of opening it, his hand resting against the wood as if feeling the distance between now and what came next. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, quieter now, not accusing, just needing an answer she could hold on to. Ethan did not turn around when he answered. "Because you are here," he said, simple, final, as if that alone explained everything that mattered. And outside, the riders came into view, shadows stretching long across the dirt as the sun dipped lower, their voices calling out her name again, louder this time, closer, and Clara felt something shift inside her, not the loss she had already faced, but something new, something uncertain, because for the first time since the storm, she realized the man standing between her and what was coming was not someone she understood, and that made him harder to push away than any danger she had known before. The first rider reached the edge of the yard just as the last light of day stretched thin across the desert, his horse slowing without command, as if even the animal could feel the weight of what stood ahead, and behind him, 3 more followed, their silhouettes sharp against the fading sky, men dressed in clean coats that did not belong to this land, not like the dust-worn boards of Ethan's cabin or the quiet resilience that held it upright. And Clara recognized them before they spoke, not by their faces, but by the way they carried themselves, upright, certain, as if the world had always moved to make room for them. Clara, her father's voice came first, firm, controlled, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed without question, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, not in relief, but in preparation, because she knew what would follow, the assumptions, the judgments, the decisions already made before a single truth could be spoken. Ethan opened the door slowly, not wide, just enough to step outside, his movement unhurried, deliberate, like a man walking into weather he had already accepted. He did not reach for the rifle inside, did not raise his hands. He simply stood there, one man in front of 4, and the space between them felt larger than the land itself. "You have something that belongs to me," her father said, his gaze fixed not on Ethan, but past him, as though the man in front of him was no more than an obstacle, and Ethan did not move aside. "Not yet, she is not something," he replied, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach them without needing force, and that was the first crack, small but real, in the certainty the riders brought with them. Clara heard it from inside, felt it settle somewhere deeper than she expected, because no one had spoken about her like that in a long time, not as a person, not as someone separate from what she represented. "Step aside," her father continued, a slight edge now threading through his words, not anger, but impatience, the kind that comes from being denied even briefly, and Ethan tilted his head just slightly, not in defiance, but in consideration, as if weighing something invisible between them. "You can come in," he said after a moment. "But you leave your assumptions outside." The words were simple, almost quiet, but they did not bend, and the men exchanged glances, brief, uncertain, because that was not how this usually went, not in their world, not with someone like him, and for the first time, the balance shifted, just enough to be felt. Clara pushed herself upright inside, her hands gripping the edge of the bed, her breath steadying, not because the situation had eased, but because something inside her had begun to change. Something that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with the man standing between her and it. Her father dismounted slowly, boots meeting the ground with purpose, each step toward the cabin measured, controlled, and when he reached the door, he paused, just long enough to look Ethan in the eyes, truly look this time, and in that moment, the silence between them spoke louder than anything else, because one man saw ownership, and the other saw presence, and only one of those could hold its ground without force. "Very well," her father said at last, his voice quieter now, not softer, but adjusted, as if recognizing something he had not expected to find, and he stepped forward. Crossing the threshold Ethan had not moved from, not because he was pushed, but because he chose not to be, and inside, Clara watched them both, the man who had raised her and the man who had stayed, and for the first time, she was not sure which one truly saw her. The room felt smaller with him inside it, not because of his size, but because of the way everything seemed to align around his presence. Clara's father stepped forward with the same measured confidence he carried everywhere, his coat still clean despite the miles behind him, his eyes scanning the cabin not with curiosity, but with quiet judgment, taking in the rough table, the single bed, the worn floorboards that creaked under each step, and then finally, settling on Clara, and for a moment, something shifted in his expression, not quite relief, not quite concern, but something closer to calculation. "You should not have wandered this far," he said, his tone controlled, as if the storm itself had been a minor inconvenience rather than something that could take a life apart in a single hour. Clara did not answer immediately, her hands resting still against the blanket, her posture upright now, not strong, not yet, but no longer broken in the way she had been before. "I did not wander," she replied, her voice quieter than his, but steadier than it had been since she woke, and that alone caused a subtle pause, the kind that most would miss, but Ethan did not, because he was watching without appearing to, standing just inside the doorway, not intruding, not retreating, simply present. "Then you were careless," her father continued, adjusting his gloves as if the conversation required order more than empathy. "Either way, we will correct it," and there it was, the familiar rhythm of control, of decisions made on her behalf long before she had the chance to speak them herself. Clara's eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan, not for permission, not for protection, but as if measuring something she had not yet understood, something that stood in quiet contrast to the man in front of her. "There is nothing to correct," she said, and this time, her voice did not waver, and that was when the air changed again, not with force, but with recognition, because those were not the words he expected, not from her, not in this place. One of the men behind her father shifted slightly, the faint creak of leather breaking the stillness, a reminder that the world outside still operated on different rules, rules where silence often meant agreement, and agreement meant movement. "You will come home," her father said, more firmly now, not louder, but with that unmistakable finality that had ended many conversations. Before they began, Clara lowered her gaze then, not in submission, but in thought, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket slowly, as if grounding herself in something real, something that did not change with a command. And when she lifted her eyes again, they did not go to her father first, they went to Ethan, and he did not nod, did not speak, did not offer anything she could lean on. He simply met her gaze for a brief second, then looked away, as if reminding her that whatever choice came next belonged to her alone, and that was when she understood it, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the difference, enough to recognize that one man had always spoken for her, while the other had never tried. "I cannot walk," she said finally, the word simple, direct, but carrying more weight than anything else in the room. Her father's expression tightened, just slightly, the first true sign that something had shifted beyond his control. "Then we will carry you," he answered without hesitation, already solving the problem as he saw it, already moving past it. But Clara did not look at him when he said it. She looked down at her hands again, then slowly back up, her gaze steady now, clear in a way it had not been before. "That is not the same as standing," she said, and this time, no one spoke after, because the truth had settled into the space between them, quiet, undeniable, and for the first time since he entered, her father did not have an answer ready, while behind him, the desert wind moved softly against the cabin walls, carrying with it the sense that something had already changed, even if no one had yet decided what to do about it. Silence did not leave the room after her words, it settled deeper, heavier, like something that had been waiting for its moment to arrive, and Clara could feel it in the way no one moved right away, not her father, not the men behind him, not even Ethan by the door, because what she had said was not loud, not dramatic, but it changed the ground beneath them all the same. Her father removed his gloves slowly, one finger at a time, as if giving himself space to consider a response that would restore order, restore expectation, restore the version of the world he understood. "Standing is not required," he said at last, placing the gloves carefully on the table as though the gesture itself carried authority. "What matters is that you return to where you belong." And there it was again, the quiet certainty that belonging could be decided by someone else, that place defined value more than the person within it. Clara listened, but something in her no longer aligned with those words. Not after the storm, not after waking in a place where no one told her what she was supposed to be. She shifted slightly on the bed, her movement small but deliberate, testing balance not just in her body, but in her resolve. "And where is that?" she asked, her tone not defiant, but searching, as if the answer mattered in a way it never had before. Her father looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment, the man who always knew exactly what to say found himself adjusting to a question he had never needed to answer. "With your family," he replied, more carefully now, "with people who can provide for you, protect you," and the word protect lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Clara's gaze dropped briefly, not in doubt, but in thought, her fingers pressing lightly into the fabric beneath her, grounding herself in something real, something she could feel, because protection had always been offered to her, always defined for her, but never once had it asked her what it cost. "He protected me," she said quietly, lifting her eyes again, and this time they did not move away, they held, steady, clear, and the room shifted again, not outwardly, but in that subtle way that changes everything once it settles. Her father's expression tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to resistance, because this was not the direction the conversation was meant to take. "He found you," he corrected, his voice firm, reclaiming control where he could. "That is not the same," and Clara paused, just long enough for the weight of that difference to settle. Then she shook her head, slowly. "No," she said. He stayed, and the simplicity of it left no room to argue, no space to reshape it into something more convenient. Because staying was not an accident, not a circumstance, it was a choice, and everyone in that room understood the difference, even if no one wanted to name it. Ethan shifted slightly near the door, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just adjusting his stance as if to remind himself he was still part of the moment, even without speaking, and her father noticed it then. Truly noticed him for the first time, not as an obstacle, but as a man who had made a decision that could not be undone by authority alone. "You believe this is where you belong now?" her father asked, quieter than before, the edge replaced by something more measured, more uncertain, and Clara did not answer right away, not because she did not know, but because for the first time, the answer was not simple, it was not given, it had to be chosen, and that choice carried more weight than anything she had faced before. She looked around the small cabin, at the rough walls, the narrow bed, the open space that held no expectation beyond what you could carry yourself, and then she looked at Ethan again, just for a second, long enough to recognize the one thing that had not changed since she woke: he had never told her what to do, never told her where she belonged, and that absence spoke louder than any promise ever had. "I do not know yet," she said finally, and the honesty of it settled into the room like a quiet truth no one could argue with. And outside, the last light faded completely, leaving only the soft sound of wind against wood, as if the desert itself was waiting to see what she would decide next. The night settled in slowly, not with darkness alone, but with a kind of stillness that made every sound feel deliberate. The men outside no longer shifted their weight or spoke in low voices, they waited, because waiting was easier than understanding what had just happened inside that small cabin, and Clara could feel that pause stretch outward, beyond the walls, beyond the men, into the desert itself. As if everything had taken one step back to see what she would do next, her father remained where he stood, his posture still upright, still controlled, but no longer untouched by uncertainty, because her answer had not rejected him, but it had not followed him either, and that space between those two things was unfamiliar ground. "Not knowing is not a place to stay," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, not commanding, but guiding, as though he could still bring her back with the right words, the right tone, the same way he always had. Clara listened, but something in her had shifted beyond that reach, not completely, not yet, but enough to make her question whether certainty had ever truly belonged to her at all. She moved her hand slightly, testing balance again, feeling the absence beneath the bandage, not with fear this time, but with awareness, and that awareness did not break her the way it had before, it steadied her in a way she could not yet explain. "Maybe it is," she said, her voice soft, but grounded, and that answer did not challenge him directly. It simply refused to bend, and that was something her father was not accustomed to, not from her, not from anyone he considered under his care. One of the men near the door shifted again, glancing toward Ethan briefly, as if expecting him to step in, to speak, to claim something, but Ethan did not move. He remained where he had been since the beginning, just inside the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the frame, his presence unchanged, his silence consistent, and that silence began to take on its own kind of weight, not empty, not passive, but steady, like a line drawn without needing to be pointed out. "You cannot remain here," her father continued, though there was less certainty in it now, more insistence than authority. "This place cannot give you what you need." Clara looked around again, not with doubt, but with a kind of clarity that had not been there before, the rough table, the worn floor, the quiet that did not demand anything from her, and then she looked back at him. "It already has," she said, and that was the moment the room changed completely, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a way that could not be undone, because what she had received here was not something that could be packed or carried, not something that could be replaced by comfort or wealth. It was something simpler, something harder to name, and her father felt it even if he did not understand it. His gaze shifted then, finally, fully, toward Ethan, and for the first time, it was not dismissive, not passing, it was direct, searching, measuring something he had not considered before, and Ethan met that look without resistance, without challenge, just steady, the way he had been since the beginning, and that steadiness held, not because it forced anything, but because it did not need to. "What did you give her?" her father asked, the question quiet, but real, and Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because the answer was not something he believed needed to be spoken. He glanced briefly toward Clara, then back. "A place to stay," he said simply, and the words hung there, plain, unadorned, but carrying more weight than any explanation could have, because in that moment, everyone understood that staying had never just meant a roof, it had meant something deeper, something chosen. And outside, the wind picked up again, softer this time, moving through the dark like a reminder that the world did not stop for decisions, it only waited to see which ones would last. And inside that small cabin, Clara felt something settle within her, not a final answer, not yet, but the beginning of one, shaped not by what she had lost, but by what she was finally allowed to choose. The air did not move for a long moment after his words, not because the wind had stopped, but because something inside the room had taken its place, something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that does not ask for attention but demands it anyway. Clara felt it settle across her shoulders like a weight she could finally recognize, not fear, not confusion, but responsibility, because for the first time, no one was deciding for her, not her father, not the men outside, not even the man who had carried her out of the storm. And that freedom did not feel light, it felt real. Her father exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the stillness, his eyes lowering for just a second before lifting again, not to Clara this time, but to the room itself, as if searching for something that would return this moment to its proper order. But the room offered nothing back, only the quiet truth of what had already changed. "You cannot build a life on uncertainty," he said, though the words no longer held the same certainty they once did, and Clara heard it, the shift, small but undeniable, like the first crack in something that had always seemed solid. She let her hand rest flat against the bed beside her, fingers pressing into the rough fabric as if anchoring herself to a decision she had not yet fully spoken. "Maybe life is not something you build all at once," she replied, her voice steady now in a way it had not been before, and there was no challenge in it, no defiance, just a quiet acceptance of something larger than either of them. Ethan moved then, not toward the center of the room, not into the conversation, but toward the table, reaching for a small tin cup and filling it with water from a jug that sat near the wall, his movements unhurried, unremarkable, but somehow grounding, as if reminding the space that not everything needed to be decided in a single breath. He placed the cup within Clara's reach without looking at her, without waiting for acknowledgement. Then stepped back again, returning to his place near the door, and that small act carried more weight than anything spoken, because it asked for nothing in return. Her father noticed it too, the way the man moved through the room without claiming it, without asserting anything beyond presence, and something in that began to shift his understanding, not fully, not yet, but enough to make him hesitate where he would have once spoken. "If you stay," he began, the words slower now, more careful, "you will not have what you are used to," and Clara lifted her eyes to meet his, not resisting, not denying, simply listening, because for the first time, she was not being told what she would lose, she was being asked to consider what she would choose. "I already do not," she answered, and the truth of it settled without resistance, without argument, because it was not something anyone could take from her now, not what she had seen, not what she had felt, not the way the world had shifted in a single day. Her father nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something he could not change, and in that moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by authority, but by understanding that had arrived too late to prevent what came next. Outside, one of the men shifted again, glancing toward the horizon where night had fully taken hold, the urgency of leaving pressing quietly at the edges of the moment, and Clara felt it too, the sense that this choice would not wait forever, that the world beyond this cabin would continue whether she followed it or not. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, not because she was afraid, but because she understood now that what came next would not be undone. She looked once more around the room, then at Ethan, who stood exactly where he had always been, unchanged, and in that stillness, she found something she had not known she was looking for, not safety, not certainty, but space, and that space was enough. "I am not ready to leave," she said, the words quiet but final, and no one spoke after, because the decision had already been made long before it was said. And outside, the wind moved softly through the dark, carrying with it the sense that something had ended, and something else had just begun. Her words did not echo, they settled, firm and quiet, like something placed carefully on a table that no one dared to move, and for a long moment, her father simply looked at her, not as a man issuing orders, but as someone trying to understand a language he had never needed to learn before, the kind that was not spoken through authority or expectation, but through choice, real choice. The kind that could not be corrected once it was made. He drew a slow breath, the weight of it visible in the slight rise of his shoulders, and when he spoke again, the edge was gone, replaced by something more measured, more human. "You believe this is temporary," he said, not as a question, but as something he needed to believe for himself. Clara did not answer right away, not because she was unsure, but because she understood now that every word she chose would shape what came next. And that was a responsibility she had never been given before. She glanced down at the cup Ethan had placed beside her, untouched until now, and lifted it slowly, her hand steady, not because she felt strong, but because she had stopped pretending she needed to be anything else. She took a small sip, the water cool and grounding, then set it back down with care, as if even that simple action carried meaning. "I believe it is real," she said finally, and that answer did not argue, did not resist, it simply stood on its own. And that was harder to dismiss than any defiance could have been. One of the men near the doorway shifted again, glancing toward her father as if waiting for instruction, because this was the moment where decisions were usually made, where direction was given, but none came, not immediately, because her father was still looking at her, still trying to reconcile the daughter he knew with the woman sitting in front of him, and the difference between those two things was no longer something he could ignore. Outside, the horses stamped lightly against the dirt, restless in the quiet, sensing movement that had not yet happened, and the night pressed closer around the cabin, wrapping it in a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself was holding back just long enough to let this moment finish unfolding. "And what happens when it is not enough?" her father asked, softer now, not challenging, but searching, because for the first time, he was not trying to change her mind, he was trying to understand where it might lead. Clara lifted her eyes again, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without fear, and for the first time since he had arrived, there was no distance in it, no barrier of expectation or obedience, just clarity. "Then I will know that I chose it," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument ever could, because it was not about the outcome, it was about ownership, about standing in something even if it did not hold, and that was a language her father had never spoken with her before. He nodded slowly, once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and that small motion shifted everything, because it was not permission, but it was not refusal either, it was something in between, something closer to respect than anything he had offered before. Ethan remained where he had been, silent, still, but there was a subtle change in the way he held himself, not pride, not relief, just a quiet recognition that the choice had been made without him needing to guide it, and that was the only kind that ever lasted. "We will leave at first light," her father said at last, turning slightly toward the door, not as a command to her, but as a statement to the men waiting outside, and that was when Clara understood. Not everything, not yet, but enough. He was not taking her with him, not forcing her back into the life she had known, he was stepping away from the decision, allowing it to remain hers, and that was something she had never expected from him. The men outside began to move, quiet, efficient, preparing for departure without question, because they followed direction, not understanding, and as the sound of their movement drifted through the open doorway, Clara felt something shift inside her again, not relief, not triumph, but something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself. She looked once more toward Ethan, who had not moved, not spoken, not claimed anything in this entire exchange, and yet had changed everything by simply staying, and in that moment, she realized that what she had chosen was not a place, not a man, not even a life she could fully see yet. It was something quieter, something harder, the right to stand in her own story, even if she had to learn how from the beginning. The night did not rush them, it stretched, long and quiet, giving space for everything that had been said to settle into something real, and Clara felt it in the way her breathing slowed, in the way her hands no longer searched for something to hold on to, because for the first time since the storm, she was not waiting for the next thing to happen, she was standing inside what already had. Her father moved toward the door then, not abruptly, not with the finality of a man ending a conversation, But with the measured pace of someone who understood that what remained could not be forced into words, he paused at the threshold, one hand resting lightly against the frame, and for a moment, he did not step outside, he simply stood there, looking back at her, and the look was different now, not ownership, not expectation, but something closer to recognition, as if he were seeing her not as she had been, but as she had become in the span of a single day. The world you knew is still there. He said quietly, not as a pull, not as a promise, just as truth, and Clara nodded slightly, because she understood that, she had not lost that world, she had stepped away from it, and that difference mattered more than anything else. I know, she replied, and there was no regret in it, no hesitation, just acceptance, and that was enough. Her father gave a small nod in return, almost imperceptible, then stepped outside, the night air closing around him as the door remained open just long enough for the sound of the horses to shift, the quiet movement of men preparing to leave without needing to be told twice, and then the door closed, gently, without force, leaving Clara and Ethan alone again. But the room was not the same as it had been before. Something had changed in the space between them. Not distance, not closeness, but something quieter, something that did not need to be defined. Clara let out a slow breath, one she had not realized she had been holding, and leaned back slightly against the wall behind her, her body tired, but not in the same way it had been when she first woke. This was a different kind of weight, one that came from carrying something real instead of resisting it. Ethan moved then, not toward her, but toward the table again, adjusting the lantern so the light softened, less sharp, more steady, and that small act shifted the room into something calmer, something that did not press or demand. They will be gone by morning, he said after a moment, his voice low, not intrusive, just present, and Clara looked at him, really looked this time, not with suspicion, not with distance, but with something closer to understanding, because he had not asked her to stay, had not tried to convince her, had simply allowed her to decide, and that had changed everything. And you? She asked, her voice quiet, but clear. What will you do? Ethan paused, just for a second, as if the question had not been directed at him in a long time, as if he had not needed to consider his place in anything beyond the land he worked and the silence he kept. He leaned slightly against the table, his gaze drifting briefly toward the door, then back to her. Same as before, he said, simple, steady, and there was no weight in it, no expectation, just truth. And Clara felt something settle inside her at that, not disappointment, not relief, but something steadier, because for the first time, she understood that what she had chosen was not a person who would shape her path, but a place where she could begin to shape it herself. Outside, the faint sound of hooves moved further into the distance, fading slowly until it became nothing more than memory carried by the wind, and inside the cabin, the quiet returned, not empty, not lonely, but full in a way that did not need to be explained. Clara shifted slightly, her hand resting against the edge of the bed, feeling the solidness of it beneath her, grounding herself in what was real, and as she looked at Ethan again, she realized that nothing between them had been promised, nothing had been spoken into something permanent, and yet, in that absence, there was something stronger than any certainty she had known before, because it left room to stand, room to learn, room to become something she had never been allowed to define until now. And the night held them there, not as strangers, not as something named, but as two people who had chosen to remain when leaving would have been easier, and sometimes, that was enough to begin with. Morning did not arrive with noise, it came slowly, the kind of quiet light that slips through cracks in the wall and settles across the floor before anyone notices it has changed the room, and Clara felt it before she saw it, the faint warmth brushing against her hand where it rested on the blanket, grounding her in a moment that did not demand anything yet. She opened her eyes without urgency, without the sharp pull of fear that had followed her waking before, and for a few seconds, she simply lay there, listening, not for danger, not for voices, but for something simpler, the absence of hooves, the absence of men waiting outside. And when she realized the world beyond the cabin had moved on without her, something inside her shifted, not loss, not relief, but a quiet acknowledgement that the decision she made in the night had held through the dawn. She pushed herself up slowly, more aware now of the way her body responded, of the balance she no longer had and the one she would have to learn. And the movement was not smooth, not easy, but it was hers, and that made the difference. Across the room, Ethan was already awake, seated at the table with a piece of worn leather in his hands, working it carefully, his movement steady, practiced, as if this was how he always greeted the day, not with plans, not with words, but with something tangible, something he could shape. He did not look up right away, not because he ignored her, but because he did not assume her attention belonged to him, and that small detail remained unchanged. Even now, they left before sunrise, he said after a moment, his voice low, not interrupting the quiet, just adding to it. And Clara nodded slightly, though he was not looking, because she had already felt it, the absence that spoke louder than any confirmation. She shifted again, bracing her hand against the edge of the bed, testing the ground beneath her in a way she had not dared to before, and this time, she did not hesitate as long. She moved, carefully, slowly, letting her weight settle in a way that felt unfamiliar but not impossible. Ethan's hands paused then, just for a second, not turning, not stepping in. Just acknowledging the moment without claiming it, because he understood something she was only beginning to, that this was not something he could help her with by stepping closer, it was something she had to meet herself. She exhaled softly as she steadied, her fingers tightening slightly against the wood, her breath controlled, not because she was unafraid, but because she had already faced something greater than this, and compared to that, this felt like a beginning, not an ending. You are making something, she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, but not uncertain, and Ethan glanced down at the leather in his hands before answering. Something you will need, he said simply, and that was when she looked more closely, noticing the shape, the careful cuts, the way the material had been measured not just for function, but for fit, and she understood, not fully, but enough. He was not fixing what had been lost. He was preparing for what came next, and that difference settled into her in a way she had not expected. She took another small step, her balance shifting again, her body adjusting in ways that felt foreign but not beyond her reach, and this time, when she steadied herself, she did not look down right away. She looked forward, toward the open space of the room, toward the door that led outside, toward a world that had not changed, but would feel different now because she had. Ethan set the leather aside then, placing it carefully on the table as if it already carried weight, then stood, not approaching her, not guiding her, just standing nearby, close enough to be there if needed, far enough to let her continue, and Clara realized that this was what he had been offering from the beginning, not answers, not direction, just presence without demand, and for the first time, she understood how rare that was. She took another breath, deeper this time, and adjusted her stance again, not perfectly, not gracefully, but with intention, and as the morning light filled the room a little more with each passing second, she felt something settle into place, not certainty, not confidence, but something quieter, something that did not need to be proven yet. The simple truth that she was still here, still standing in whatever way she could, and that was enough to begin again. The sun climbed higher without asking permission, pouring light through the open doorway until the edges of everything became clearer, sharper, less forgiving, and Clara felt it in the way her shadow stretched uneven across the floor, no longer something she could ignore, but something she had to understand. She stood there longer this time, not moving, just feeling the balance settle into a place that was not natural yet, but no longer impossible, and that quiet shift mattered more than any words spoken the night before. Ethan returned to the table without comment, picking up the piece of leather again, his hands working with a patience that did not rush the outcome, and Clara watched him, not because she needed answers, but because she was beginning to understand the rhythm of this place. Nothing forced, nothing demanded, everything built slowly, with time and intention. Will it be ready today? She asked, her voice steady enough now that it did not feel borrowed, and Ethan nodded once, his eyes still on the work in his hands. By sundown, he said, simple, certain, and that gave her something to measure the day against, not a deadline, but a direction. She shifted her weight again, more deliberately now, testing how far she could move before the balance faltered. One step, then another, small, uneven, but forward, and the distance between the bed and the table closed inch by inch, not gracefully, not easily, but honestly, and when she reached the edge of the table, she rested her hand there, not out of weakness, but as part of the process, part of learning something new. Ethan did not stop her, did not offer support, he only adjusted his position slightly so she had the space she needed, and that quiet awareness meant more than any assistance would have. She looked down at the leather again, seeing now how it was shaped, not just to replace, but to fit her, to meet her where she was instead of forcing her into what she had been. And that understanding settled deeper than she expected. "You knew," she said after a moment, not accusing, not questioning, just stating something she had begun to realize. Ethan paused, his hands stilling briefly before continuing. "I have seen it before," he replied, and there was no story attached to it, no explanation offered, just the weight of experience carried without display, and Clara nodded slightly, because she did not need more than that. She understood enough. She moved her hand from the table and tried again, another step. This one steadier, then another, and when she faltered, she did not stop. She adjusted, learning in real time what her body could still do, and what it needed to become. Outside, the wind moved lightly across the open land, carrying with it the faint sound of nothing at all, no riders, no voices, just the quiet that comes when the world has already moved on, and Clara felt that too, not as abandonment, but as space to grow into something she had not yet defined. She reached the doorway after a while, the light stronger there, the air warmer, and she paused, looking out at the wide stretch of desert that had taken something from her and given something back in return, not equally, not fairly, but undeniably. Ethan set the finished piece of leather down then, standing slowly, not rushing toward her, just stepping closer, enough to place the crafted support within reach. He did not hand it to her directly, he set it beside her on the wooden ledge, letting her decide when to take it, and Clara looked at it for a long moment, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with understanding. This was not the end of what she had lost, it was the beginning of what she would build. She reached for it finally, her hand steady, and as she held it, she felt the weight of something new, something not yet familiar, but not beyond her, and when she lifted her eyes again, the horizon did not feel as distant as it had before, because for the first time, she was not looking at where she had been, she was looking at where she could go. By the time the sun began to fall, the desert had turned quiet again, not empty, but settled, like it had already accepted whatever story had passed through it and moved on without needing to hold on to it. And Clara stood in the doorway longer than she realized, the wooden frame steady beneath her hand, the new weight at her side unfamiliar but no longer strange. She had not mastered it, not yet, but she no longer feared it either, and that was where everything had begun to change. Ethan remained a few steps behind her, not watching closely, not measuring her progress, just present in the same way he had been since the beginning, steady, unspoken, and that steadiness had given her something no one else ever had, the space to become without being told what she should be. She took a careful step forward, then another, out past the doorway and onto the hard-packed earth, the ground uneven beneath her, the air warmer here, carrying the scent of dust and sun-baked wood, and for a moment she paused, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to feel it, the difference between standing inside and stepping into something new. The horizon stretched wide in front of her, unchanged, indifferent, but no longer distant in the same way, because she was not looking at it from where she had been, she was meeting it from where she stood now. "It will take time," Ethan said quietly behind her, not as a warning, not as a limit, just a truth offered without expectation, and Clara nodded slightly, because she understood that now, time was not something to outrun, it was something to walk through, step by step, even if those steps were uneven, even if they had to be learned again from the beginning. She shifted her weight once more, adjusting, correcting, finding balance not in what she had lost, but in what remained, and then she moved again, one step further into the open, the ground holding beneath her, not perfectly, but enough, and that was all she needed. Behind her, Ethan turned slightly, returning to the quiet work that waited inside, not because he was leaving her, but because he understood something she was only just beginning to, that this part, this choosing, this moving forward, was hers alone, and it did not need an audience, it only needed space. Clara did not look back right away, not because she had forgotten him, but because she no longer needed to measure herself against anyone else. She let her gaze rest on the line where sky met earth, that thin place where everything seemed possible and unreachable at the same time, and for the first time since the storm, she did not feel pulled backward by what had been taken. She felt something else, something quieter, something steadier, the beginning of a path that had not been chosen for her, but by her, and as the light softened around her, Casting long shadows across the ground, she took another step, then another. Each one small, each one real, and somewhere behind her, inside that simple cabin, a man who never asked her to stay continued his day without needing to say a word, because out here, the kind of bond that mattered most was not built on promises or declarations, it was built on something far quieter, the willingness to remain when leaving would have been easier, and the understanding that sometimes, the strongest thing a person can offer is not direction, not protection, but the freedom to stand on their own, even when the ground has changed beneath them. And in that quiet space between who she had been and who she was becoming, Clara Whitmore did not feel broken, she felt unfinished, and for the first time, that did not frighten her at all.